The towering spires of the Sirac citadel shimmered against the pale light of the twin moons, casting an otherworldly glow over the gathering. Inside the grand hall, the air was thick with tension, every movement deliberate, every breath measured. Daniel Rowe adjusted the collar of his formal uniform, trying to ignore the stares of the Sirac delegation. Their smooth, pale blue skin reflected the ambient light, their eyes, large and shimmering, fixed on him with an intensity that made his pulse quicken. This wasn't his first diplomatic mission, but it was certainly his most precarious. The Sirac were proud, their customs labyrinthine, and any misstep could collapse the fragile negotiations. He scanned the room, his gaze landing on the delegation's leader, Lyra. Her presence was striking, tall and poised, her bioluminescent petals shimmering faintly along her arms and shoulders. The petals pulsed gently, a sign of her calm, though her sharp gaze betrayed a steely determination. "Ambassador Rowe," she said, her voice smooth yet commanding, "we welcome you to our citadel." Daniel nodded, stepping forward to offer his hand in a gesture of goodwill. Lyra regarded the gesture with a tilt of her head, her expression unreadable. After a beat, she raised her hand, but instead of shaking his, she held her palm upright, revealing the glowing underside of her petals. "Place your hand here," she instructed, her tone carefully neutral. Daniel hesitated for a fraction of a second, then complied. His hand met the soft petals, and immediately, a warm, tingling sensation coursed through his palm. The petals reacted, glowing brighter, and a faint mist of luminescent particles rose between their hands. The room fell silent. Lyra's eyes widened ever so slightly, and the soft hum of Sirac whispers filled the air. Daniel pulled his hand back, confused by the sudden shift in mood. He looked at Lyra, whose calm facade had faltered. Her petals now glowed with a vibrant intensity, and her gaze was locked onto him, a mixture of shock and something else, something he couldn't quite place. "What just happened?" Daniel asked, his voice low. One of the Sirac advisors stepped forward, his tone sharp. "You have performed the ritual of binding." Daniel blinked. "The what?" Lyra took a step closer, her composure slipping further. "In our culture, the act of touching one's petals, specifically during a formal ceremony, signifies a profound bond. It is a proposal of union." Daniel's stomach sank. "Union? As in marriage?" Lyra finished, her voice barely above a whisper. "A bond of mateship, unbreakable and sacred." The weight of her words hit him like a freight train. He opened his mouth to protest, but Lyra raised a hand to silence him, her gaze now cool and calculating. "This was not your intent. I understand that. However, the bond has been initiated, and to reject it now would be a grave insult to my people." Daniel exhaled sharply, his mind racing. The stakes were clear. Rejecting the bond could shatter the peace talks and ignite a conflict neither side could afford. But the alternative, a binding commitment to an alien he had just met, was equally unthinkable. "I didn't know," he said, his voice tight. "Surely there's a way to undo this?" Lyra's expression hardened. "There is not. Once the petals respond, the bond is set in motion. It must be honored, or it will be seen as a rejection of our ways." The murmurs among the Sirac grew louder, and Daniel felt the weight of their eyes on him. His heart pounded in his chest as he weighed his options, but it was clear there was only one path forward. "What does this bond entail?" he asked, his tone measured. Lyra hesitated, her gaze softening just slightly. "There are stages to the bond. The first is the exchange of nectar, a ritual that deepens the connection and solidifies trust. It is an intimate process." Daniel felt his face heat. He wasn't sure what he had expected, but the idea of such a ritual with Lyra, under these circumstances, made his throat tighten. He glanced around the room, realizing there would be no privacy, no way to discuss this further without scrutiny. Lyra seemed to sense his unease. She straightened, her voice firm. "We will adjourn for now. The ritual must be completed soon, but for the sake of our negotiations, we will proceed in private." The Serac advisors nodded in agreement, and with a wave of Lyra's hand, the gathering began to disperse. Daniel followed her out of the hall, his mind a whirlwind of thoughts. They walked in silence through the dimly lit corridors until they reached a private chamber. Lyra closed the door behind them and turned to face him. "This is not ideal for either of us," she said, her tone softer now. "But our people depend on us to see this through." Daniel ran a hand through his hair, leaning against the wall. "You're remarkably calm about all this." Lyra's lips quirked into a faint smile. "I have been trained to remain calm in the face of adversity. But do not mistake calm for ease. This situation is unprecedented." For a moment, they simply looked at each other, the tension between them palpable. Despite the absurdity of the situation, Daniel couldn't deny the strange pull he felt toward her, a connection that defied logic. "What happens next?" he asked finally. Lyra stepped closer, her bioluminescent petals glowing faintly. "We begin the ritual. The nectar exchange will solidify the bond, but it will not complete it. For now, it will satisfy the ceremonial requirements and allow us to proceed with the negotiations." Daniel nodded, his throat dry. "And what does that entail?" Lyra raised her hand, her petals shimmering softly. "You must touch them again. The nectar is exchanged through direct contact. It will not harm you, but it will feel intense." Daniel hesitated, then reached out, his fingers brushing against the soft petals once more. The warmth returned, spreading through his hand and up his arm. But this time it was accompanied by a deeper sensation, a current of energy that seemed to flow between them. Lyra's eyes fluttered shut for a moment, and her breathing slowed. The glow intensified, and Daniel felt a strange mix of emotions: calm, trust, and something deeper, more primal. When Lyra finally opened her eyes, they were filled with a warmth that hadn't been there before. "It is done," she said softly. "For now." Daniel pulled his hand back, his mind still reeling from the experience. The bond was real and there was no turning back. He could only hope they would find a way to navigate this together without losing themselves in the process. "We'll make this work," he said, more to himself than to her. Lyra nodded, her expression resolute. "We must. For both our peoples." Outside, the storm of politics and danger loomed. But for now, they stood on the precipice of an uncharted path. Together. The private chamber's soft, bioluminescent light bathed everything in a cool, bluish glow. Daniel sat at the edge of a low, curved bench, his thoughts a tangled mess. Across from him, Lyra stood perfectly still, her hands clasped behind her back, her expression as composed as ever. The silence between them stretched, heavy with unspoken tension. "You're quiet," Daniel finally said, his voice low. Lyra tilted her head slightly. "I am considering our situation. It is complex. That's one way to put it." He sighed, leaning forward with his elbows on his knees. "You seem to be handling this a lot better than I am." Her gaze softened, though only slightly. "Do not mistake my calm for indifference. This bond carries a weight that I do not take lightly." Daniel looked up at her, studying her face. Despite her composed exterior, he could see the subtle signs of strain, the faint lines at the corners of her eyes, the slight tension in her shoulders. She was struggling too, though she hid it well. "So what happens if we don't go through with this?" he asked. "If we refuse to complete the bond?" Lyra's expression darkened. "The consequences would be severe. Our people would see it as a rejection, not just of each other, but of the unity this bond symbolizes. It would fracture the trust we have worked so hard to build. War could follow." Daniel rubbed a hand over his face. "No pressure, then." For a moment, neither of them spoke. The weight of their shared responsibility pressed down on them, heavy and unavoidable. Finally, Lyra stepped closer, her movements fluid and deliberate. She stopped a few paces away from him, her bioluminescent petals pulsing faintly. "We cannot undo what has been set in motion," she said. "But perhaps we can find a way to navigate this together." Daniel met her gaze, searching for any hint of doubt. Instead, he found only resolve. He nodded slowly, his chest tightening with a mix of apprehension and determination. "All right," he said. "Let's figure this out." Lyra inclined her head, a faint glimmer of approval in her eyes. She moved to sit beside him on the bench, her presence both calming and disconcerting. For a moment, they simply sat in silence, the only sound the faint hum of the Citadel's energy fields. "Tell me," Daniel said after a while, "what exactly does this bond mean to your people? Beyond the rituals." Lyra's gaze flicked to his, her expression thoughtful. "The bond is a union of trust and loyalty. It is a connection that goes beyond the physical. It is a melding of two beings, a partnership in every sense of the word. Through the bond, we share not only our strengths but our vulnerabilities." Daniel nodded slowly. "And this nectar exchange, that's part of it?" She hesitated, then nodded. "Yes, it is an essential step. The nectar carries our essence, our emotions. Through its exchange, we begin to understand each other on a deeper level." The way she spoke of it, so clinical yet reverent, made Daniel's pulse quicken. The idea of sharing something so intimate with someone he barely knew was both unsettling and strangely compelling. Lyra seemed to sense his unease. "I do not expect you to be comfortable with this," she said softly, "but I ask for your trust. This bond, though forced upon us, could become a strength." Daniel looked at her, really looked at her. For all her alien features, there was something undeniably human in her eyes. A flicker of uncertainty, a vulnerability she was trying to hide. In that moment, he made a decision. "All right," he said, his voice steady. "Let's do this." Lyra nodded, her composure returning. She reached out, her hand hovering just above his. "May I?" she asked, her tone gentle. Daniel swallowed hard and nodded. Her fingers brushed against his, and once again, he felt the warmth of her touch, the faint tingling that spread up his arm. Slowly, she guided his hand toward her petals, her movements deliberate and careful. As his fingertips grazed the soft, glowing petals, he felt a rush of warmth, followed by a surge of emotions that weren't his own. Curiosity, determination, and beneath it all, a deep, unspoken fear. He glanced at Lyra, realizing she was sharing a part of herself with him, her emotions laid bare through their connection. "It's intense," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Lyra nodded, her eyes half closed. "It is a reflection of our bond. As it deepens, so too will our understanding of each other." Daniel's hand lingered on her petals, the glow intensifying with each passing moment. He could feel the exchange happening, a subtle yet profound transfer of energy and emotion. It was unlike anything he had ever experienced, a connection that transcended words and physicality. Lyra's breathing slowed, her shoulders relaxing as the ritual progressed. Daniel felt his own tension ease, replaced by a strange sense of calm. For the first time since this ordeal began, he felt a glimmer of hope, that maybe, just maybe, they could make this work. After what felt like an eternity, Lyra gently pulled her hand away, breaking the connection. The glow of her petals dimmed, and the room seemed to grow quieter. "It is done," she said softly, her voice steady but tinged with something unspoken. "For now." Daniel exhaled slowly, his mind still reeling from the experience. He looked at Lyra, searching her face for any sign of regret or hesitation. Instead, he found a quiet strength, a determination that mirrored his own. "What now?" he asked. Lyra stood, her movements graceful. "Now we prepare. The bond is only the beginning. There will be challenges ahead, both within and beyond these walls." Daniel nodded, rising to his feet. "Then we face them together." Lyra met his gaze, her eyes reflecting a mix of gratitude and resolve. "Yes," she said. Together. As they left the chamber, the weight of their bond settled between them, not as a burden, but as a shared responsibility. The path ahead was uncertain, fraught with danger and doubt, but for the first time, Daniel felt a sense of purpose. Whatever lay ahead, they would face it as one. The halls of the Citadel pulsed with an eerie calm, the ambient glow of its bioluminescent walls casting soft light over the otherwise cold architecture. Daniel followed Lyra through the maze-like corridors, their footsteps echoing in sync. The initial bond ritual had left him physically fine but mentally unmoored, his thoughts circling back to the warmth of her touch, the rush of shared emotions. It had been unsettling yet oddly grounding, as if a small part of her now lived within him. "We'll return to the negotiation chambers soon," Lyra said, her voice breaking the silence. "But first, you need to understand the risks we now face." Daniel nodded, quickening his pace to match hers. "Risks beyond offending your people?" Lyra gave a curt nod. "There are factions within the Sirac who oppose this treaty. They see unity with humanity as a threat to our sovereignty. Your presence and our bond will not be welcomed by all." Before Daniel could respond, a loud, resonant chime filled the air. Lyra halted, her body tense. Daniel instinctively reached for the small sidearm at his belt, his combat instincts kicking in. "What is it?" he asked. Lyra's petals flared briefly, their light brightening in a signal of alarm. "The Citadel's defenses have been breached." "Breached? By who?" Before she could answer, a sudden explosion rocked the corridor, sending a blast of heat and debris toward them. Daniel grabbed Lyra, pulling her behind a support pillar as shards of alien metal rained down. The lights dimmed, and the hum of the Citadel's energy system faltered. When the dust settled, Lyra pulled away, her eyes sharp. "We need to move. They'll be coming for us." Daniel didn't need to ask who they were. He followed her as she led him down a side passage, their pace quick but cautious. The sound of distant gunfire echoed through the halls, and Daniel's grip tightened on his weapon. They rounded a corner, and Lyra stopped abruptly, raising a hand. Two Sirac soldiers lay in wait, their sleek, crystalline weapons aimed directly at them. Daniel tensed, but Lyra stepped forward, her petals dimming in what Daniel had learned was a sign of authority. "Stand down," she ordered. "You serve the Sirac people, not the rebels." The soldiers hesitated, their eyes flicking to Daniel. One of them, a younger male with pale blue skin and a tense posture, spoke. "You have bonded with the human. You are no longer one of us." Lyra's gaze hardened. "I serve our people's future. This bond is the first step toward peace. Stand down or you will be considered traitors." The soldiers exchanged a glance, then raised their weapons again. But Daniel didn't wait. He fired, his shots precise, aimed to disarm rather than kill. The weapons clattered to the floor, and the soldiers recoiled in pain, their crystalline armor crackling. "Let's go," Daniel said, grabbing Lyra's arm. They moved quickly, navigating the increasingly unstable corridors. Alarms blared, and the glow of the Citadel's walls flickered sporadically. Lyra led them to a concealed lift, activating it with a swift touch of her hand to a panel. The doors slid open, and they stepped inside, the hum of the lift rising as it descended. "Who are these rebels?" Daniel asked, breaking the tense silence. "They are traditionalists," Lyra said. "They believe in the old ways where isolation ensured our survival. They see your kind as a contaminant, and our bond as a betrayal." Daniel frowned. "And they're willing to kill to stop it?" Lyra's expression was grim. "They would rather see our people divided and weakened than united with yours." The lift came to a halt, and the doors opened to reveal a large, circular chamber filled with glowing data streams. It was some kind of control center with holographic displays projecting tactical readouts. A lone Sirac technician stood at the center, his eyes widening when he saw them. "Commander Lyra," he said, his voice urgent. "The rebels have seized the outer defenses. They're deploying a weapon, something we've never seen before." Lyra stepped forward. "Show me." The technician activated a display, and an image appeared. A massive crystalline structure, pulsating with energy, mounted on a stolen Sirac warship. Daniel narrowed his eyes, recognizing the strategic implications immediately. "That thing looks like it could level this entire citadel," he said. Lyra nodded. "It's a prototype energy disruptor. If they activate it, it will disable all defensive systems within a 100-mile radius." We'll be defenseless. Daniel clenched his jaw. We can't let that happen. Lyra turned to the technician. Can we override the disruptor remotely? He shook his head. The rebels have locked us out of the system. The only way to stop it is to destroy it manually. Daniel sighed. Of course it is. Lyra's petals dimmed further, a sign of her resolve. Then we'll do it ourselves. The technician hesitated. Commander, you'll need to get close. The disruptor's core can only be destroyed from within. Lyra nodded. Understood. Daniel stepped forward. I'm coming with you. Lyra met his gaze, her expression unreadable for a moment. Then she nodded. We'll need to work together. Our bond may be the key to getting close enough to disable the core. Daniel frowned. How? Lyra's gaze flicked to his hand, where the faint glow from their earlier bond ritual still lingered. The disruptor's core responds to Sirac energy signatures. Our shared bond may confuse its systems, allowing us to bypass its defenses. Daniel nodded, his mind already working through the logistics. Then we'd better move fast. Lyra turned to the technician. Seal this room and alert the remaining loyalists. We'll need them to cover our approach. The technician saluted. Good luck, Commander. As they left the control center, the weight of their mission settled heavily on Daniel's shoulders. The bond, once an unwanted burden, was now their greatest weapon. The rebels' disruptor loomed ahead, its power a threat to everything they were trying to protect. They had no choice but to trust each other completely. Their survival and the future of both their species depended on it. The cold night air of the Sirac plains bit at Daniel's skin as he and Lyra moved swiftly through the shadowy terrain. The citadel loomed behind them, its spires dim under the emergency protocols. Ahead, the stolen warship stood out against the dark sky, its crystalline structure pulsing ominously. The rebel stronghold was heavily guarded, with patrols of Sirac soldiers pacing the perimeter. Daniel crouched beside a jagged outcrop, his eyes scanning for weaknesses in their defenses. We'll need to get close to the disruptor without triggering any alarms, Lyra whispered, her voice barely audible over the distant hum of the warship's power core. Daniel nodded, his focus unwavering. What's the plan? Lyra pointed to a narrow access route along the ship's side. That path will take us to the disruptor's control room. Once inside, we'll initiate the overload sequence. The bond's energy signature should mask our presence long enough to get it done. Daniel studied her face in the dim light, noting the faint glow of her bioluminescent petals. And if it doesn't? Her eyes met his, calm but resolute. Then we improvise. They moved in silence, keeping low as they approached the access route. The guards were thorough, but their patrol patterns left brief windows of opportunity. Daniel took the lead, his military training kicking in as he timed their movements perfectly. Lyra followed close behind, her presence a steadying force. As they reached the base of the warship, Daniel pressed his back against the cold, crystalline surface, signaling for Lyra to hold. Two guards passed by, their weapons glinting faintly in the moonlight. Once they were out of sight, Daniel gestured for Lyra to follow, and they slipped into the narrow access route. The interior of the warship was colder, the hum of the disruptor growing louder with every step. The crystalline walls emitted a faint, shifting light, casting intricate patterns across their path. Daniel felt the bond pulsing faintly between him and Lyra, a constant reminder of their connection. It was both reassuring and disconcerting. They reached the control room without incident, the heavy doors sliding open with a soft hiss. Inside, the disruptor's core dominated the space, a massive crystalline structure that pulsed with a rhythmic glow. Consoles lined the walls, their displays filled with alien script and readouts. Lyra moved quickly, her fingers dancing over the controls as she initiated the overload sequence. We don't have much time, she said, her voice tense. Once the sequence starts, the core will destabilize. We'll need to be clear of the ship before it goes critical. Daniel stood guard by the door, his weapon at the ready. How long do we have? Lyra glanced at him, her expression grim. 10 minutes. Maybe less. Just as she spoke, a sudden alarm blared through the ship. Red lights flashed, and the hum of the disruptor intensified. "They know we're here," Daniel said, his voice sharp. "Can you finish?" Lyra nodded, her focus unwavering. "I just need a few more seconds." The sound of approaching footsteps echoed through the corridor. Daniel positioned himself by the door, his weapon aimed and ready. The first rebel soldier appeared and Daniel fired, his shots precise. The soldier fell, but more were on their way. "Lyra, we've got company," he shouted. "I'm almost done," she replied, her hands moving faster over the controls. "Just hold them off a little longer." Daniel gritted his teeth, taking down another soldier as they tried to breach the room. The rebels were relentless, their weapons firing in rapid bursts. Daniel ducked behind the console, returning fire as best he could. "Done," Lyra said, stepping back from the controls. The disruptor's core began to pulse erratically, its glow intensifying. "Time to go," Daniel said, grabbing her arm. They bolted from the control room, the sound of the disruptor's destabilization following them. The corridors were chaotic now, with rebel soldiers scrambling to contain the situation. Daniel and Lyra moved as one, their bond guiding their movements. They fought their way through the ship, their combined efforts taking down any resistance in their path. As they neared the exit, a sudden explosion rocked the warship, throwing them off balance. Daniel caught himself against the wall, pulling Lyra with him. "Are you all right?" he asked, his voice urgent. "I'm fine," she said, her breathing heavy. "We're almost there." They pushed forward, finally emerging into the open air. The night was alive with the sound of alarms and distant explosions. The warship's core glowed like a dying star, its light growing brighter with each passing second. "We need to get clear," Daniel shouted. They sprinted across the plains, the warship looming behind them. Just as they reached a safe distance, the disruptor's core went critical. A massive explosion tore through the night, a brilliant light consuming the warship and everything around it. The shockwave hit them seconds later, sending them sprawling to the ground. Daniel rolled onto his back, his ears ringing. He glanced over at Lyra, who was already pushing herself up, her petals dim but intact. "You okay?" he asked, his voice hoarse. She nodded, her expression weary but determined. "We did it. The disruptor is destroyed." Daniel exhaled, relief washing over him. "Yet, we did." For a moment, they simply lay there, the night sky above them filled with the fading light of the explosion. The bond between them pulsed faintly, a reminder of their shared victory. But the fight wasn't over. The rebels were still out there, and the fragile peace between their people hung in the balance. They had won this battle, but the war for unity was far from finished. Daniel sat up, offering his hand to Lyra. She took it, her grip firm and steady. Together, they rose, ready to face whatever came next. The smoke from the destroyed warship still lingered in the air as Daniel and Lyra trudged back toward the temporary encampment the Sirac loyalists had set up in the nearby hills. Every muscle in Daniel's body ached from the relentless pace and the firefight they had barely escaped. But the sight of the camp's soft lights ahead brought a small measure of relief. As they entered the camp, the tension among the gathered Sirac soldiers was palpable. Whispers followed them as they passed, some of awe, others of suspicion. Lyra ignored the stares, her head held high, her petals dimmed in a controlled display of focus. Daniel couldn't help but notice the way her posture remained firm despite the clear toll the mission had taken on her. Once inside the command tent, Lyra dismissed the surrounding aides with a flick of her hand. The room was sparse but functional, with a central table displaying a holographic map of the region. Daniel stood on the opposite side of the table, watching as Lyra placed her hands on its edge, her gaze fixed on the map. "We've dealt a significant blow to the rebels," she said, her voice steady. "But it's not over." Daniel nodded, his arms crossed. "They'll regroup, maybe even retaliate." Lyra's eyes flicked to him, a hint of weariness breaking through her composure. "Yes, and they'll be more desperate now. We've cornered them." He studied her for a moment, noting the tension in her shoulders. "You need rest," he said. "We both do." Lyra straightened, her petals flaring faintly before dimming again. Rest will come in time. For now, we must prepare for their next move. Daniel sighed, leaning against the edge of the table. You can't carry this alone, Lyra. Her gaze softened slightly, the faintest flicker of vulnerability crossing her face. I am not alone, she said quietly. We share this burden. The words carried more weight than Daniel expected, and he felt the bond between them pulse gently, a subtle reminder of their connection. He nodded, accepting her unspoken acknowledgement. I'll go check on the defenses, he said, pushing off the table. Make sure we're ready. Lyra inclined her head, a small gesture of gratitude. As he turned to leave, her voice stopped him. Daniel. He looked back, and for a moment the room seemed to shrink around them. Thank you, she said, her tone softer than before. For everything. He gave her a small, reassuring smile. We'll get through this. Stepping out of the command tent, Daniel felt the cool night air wash over him. The camp was alive with activity, soldiers reinforcing barricades and checking weaponry. Despite the exhaustion that weighed on him, he found a renewed sense of purpose in their shared determination. After ensuring the perimeter was secure, Daniel returned to the tent he shared with Lyra. The space was modest, with 2 cots and a single small heater casting a warm glow. Lyra was already there, seated on her cot, her posture relaxed but her expression thoughtful. Daniel sat across from her, his elbows resting on his knees. Any updates? He asked. She shook her head. The scouts report no immediate movement, but that could change quickly. They sat in silence for a moment, the weight of the day settling heavily between them. Finally, Lyra spoke, her voice quieter. This bond we share. It is more than I anticipated. Daniel looked at her, his brow furrowed. How so? She hesitated, her fingers lightly tracing the edge of her petals. I can feel your presence even when you are not near. Your thoughts, your emotions. They resonate with me. Daniel leaned forward slightly. I felt it too. Like you're a part of me now. Lyra's eyes met his, and for a moment, the barriers between them seemed to dissolve. It is both unsettling and comforting, she admitted. I have never experienced anything like this. Daniel nodded, his gaze steady. Neither have I. The room grew quiet again, but this time the silence was different, softer, more intimate. Without thinking, Daniel reached out, his hand hovering just above hers. Lyra's gaze dropped to his hand, and after a moment, she turned her palm upward, allowing their fingers to brush. The connection was immediate, a gentle warmth spreading between them. Lyra's petals glowed faintly, their light pulsing in rhythm with the bond. Daniel felt a surge of emotions, trust, vulnerability, and a quiet strength that mirrored his own. You're not alone, Lyra, he said softly. We'll face this together. Lyra's lips curved into a faint smile, the first genuine one he had seen from her. Together, she echoed. They remained like that for a moment longer, their hands entwined, the bond between them a steady presence. Finally, Lyra pulled back, her expression more composed. We should rest, she said, though her tone was gentle. There is still much to do. Daniel nodded, rising from his seat. Good idea. As they settled onto their respective cots, the tension in the room eased, replaced by a quiet understanding. Daniel closed his eyes, the events of the day replaying in his mind. Despite the challenges ahead, he felt a renewed sense of hope, a belief that, together, they could overcome anything. The night passed uneventfully, and when Daniel awoke, the first light of dawn was beginning to creep into the tent. Lyra was already up, her posture relaxed but alert. She glanced at him as he stirred, her expression unreadable. Morning, he said, his voice still rough from sleep. Morning, she replied. We have a long day ahead. Daniel nodded, stretching as he stood. Let's get to it. As they prepared for the day, the bond between them remained a steady undercurrent, a quiet reminder of their shared purpose. The road ahead would be difficult, but for the first time, Daniel felt truly ready to face it, side by side with Lyra. The camp was quiet in the early morning, the calm before the inevitable storm. Daniel moved through the narrow paths between tents, the cold air biting at his skin. Despite the stillness, there was an underlying tension that made every breath feel heavier. The Serac loyalists worked diligently to fortify their positions, knowing full well the rebels wouldn't stay hidden for long. Daniel entered the command tent, where Lyra was already poring over a tactical map. Her posture was as rigid as ever, but there was a subtle weariness in her eyes. She looked up as he approached, her petals dimly glowing in the muted light. "They'll strike soon," she said without preamble, her voice steady but low. The scouts report increased activity near their remaining stronghold. Daniel nodded, standing beside her to examine the map. "They'll want to retaliate after what we did to their disruptor." Lyra's expression tightened. "This will be their last stand. They'll throw everything they have at us." He placed a hand on the table, leaning closer to study the terrain. "Then we hit them first. Take the fight to them before they're ready." Lyra turned her gaze to him, considering his words. "It's a risk," she said, "but it could work. If we strike swiftly, we might catch them off guard." Daniel met her eyes, seeing the same determination reflected back at him. "It's our best shot." She nodded, then motioned to one of the aides nearby. "Gather the leaders. We'll finalize the plan." As the aide left to summon the others, Daniel leaned back, crossing his arms. "How are you holding up?" Lyra's gaze flickered, her petals brightening momentarily. "I am fine," she said, though her voice betrayed a hint of fatigue. "There is no room for weakness now." Daniel stepped closer, lowering his voice. "You're not weak, Lyra, but you don't have to carry this alone." For a moment, she didn't respond, her eyes fixed on the map. Then, slowly, she turned to face him. "The weight of leadership is heavy," she said quietly, "but with you it feels bearable." The bond between them pulsed gently, a warm reassurance that neither of them was truly alone. Daniel placed a hand on her shoulder, feeling the slight tension beneath his touch. "We'll get through this," he said firmly. Together, Lyra's petals glowed faintly, a silent acknowledgement. Before either of them could say more, the other leaders began to arrive, filling the tent with the low murmur of strategic discussion. The hours that followed were a blur of planning and preparation. By midday, the Loyalist forces were ready to move. Daniel and Lyra led the charge, their combined presence a rallying point for the troops. The march to the rebel stronghold was swift and silent, the tension thick as they approached the enemy's perimeter. The first clash came suddenly. Rebel scouts spotted their advance, and the quiet of the plains erupted into the chaos of battle. Daniel's training kicked in as he moved with precision, taking down targets and issuing commands. Lyra fought alongside him, her every movement fluid and deliberate, her crystalline weapon a blur of light. Despite the ferocity of the rebel forces, the Loyalists pushed forward, their momentum unyielding. They breached the outer defenses of the stronghold, forcing the rebels to fall back toward their central command. But as they advanced, the tide of battle shifted. A sudden explosion rocked the battlefield, sending shockwaves through the ranks. Daniel was thrown to the ground, his ears ringing. He scrambled to his feet, searching for Lyra amidst the chaos. He found her nearby, her petals glowing brightly as she fought off a group of rebels. Relief washed over him, but it was short-lived. From the center of the stronghold, a massive weapon began to power up, its crystalline core pulsing with dangerous energy. Lyra's eyes widened as she recognized the device. "They've activated another disruptor," she shouted over the noise of battle. Daniel's heart sank. "How do we stop it?" Lyra's expression was grim. "We can't disable it from here. We'll have to destroy it from within." Daniel nodded, his resolve firm. "Then let's move." They fought their way toward the disruptor, the intensity of the battle growing with every step. By the time they reached the weapon's core, they were battered but determined. Lyra immediately began working on the console, her hands moving with practiced precision. "It's shielded," she said, frustration clear in her voice. "I need more time." Daniel positioned himself in front of her, firing at any rebels who dared to approach. The minutes stretched on, each second feeling like an eternity. Finally, Lyra let out a sharp breath. "I've exposed the core," she said, "but we'll need to overload it manually." Daniel turned to her, his jaw set. "What does that mean for us?" Lyra hesitated, her petals dimming slightly. "Once the core destabilizes, we'll have less than a minute to escape." He nodded without hesitation. "Then we'll make it." Together, they initiated the overload sequence. The core began to pulse erratically, its glow intensifying. The disruptor's hum grew louder, signaling the impending collapse. "Run!" Lyra shouted, and they bolted from the room. The stronghold was a maze of collapsing corridors and erupting flames. Daniel and Lyra pushed through the chaos, their bond guiding their movements as they relied on each other to navigate the destruction. The heat and noise were overwhelming, but they didn't stop. Just as they reached the outer perimeter, the disruptor's core exploded in a brilliant flash of light. The shockwave sent them sprawling, but they had made it out. Daniel groaned as he pushed himself up, his vision blurred. He looked over and saw Lyra lying a few feet away, her chest rising and falling as she caught her breath. "You okay?" he asked, crawling toward her. She nodded weakly, her petals dim but intact. "We made it." Daniel helped her to her feet, and together they surveyed the battlefield. The rebel stronghold was in ruins, and their forces were in full retreat. The loyalists cheered, their victory hard-earned. As the dust settled, Daniel and Lyra stood side by side, their bond stronger than ever. They had faced the worst together and come out alive. But the war wasn't over yet, and they both knew the challenges ahead would test them in ways they couldn't yet imagine. For now, though, they allowed themselves a moment of quiet triumph, knowing that together, they could face whatever came next. The aftermath of the battle left the Sirac plains scarred and smoldering, the ruins of the rebel stronghold a testament to the ferocity of the conflict. Daniel stood at the edge of the battlefield, his gaze sweeping over the remnants of the enemy's forces as loyalist troops worked to secure the area. The air was heavy with the scent of scorched metal and ozone, the eerie silence broken only by the occasional distant shout or the hum of a passing patrol. Lyra approached from the camp, her steps measured but purposeful. Despite the soot and grime that marred her usually immaculate appearance, her posture remained regal, her bioluminescent petals glowing faintly. She stopped beside Daniel, her gaze fixed on the horizon. "The rebels are scattered," she said, her voice quiet but resolute. "Their forces are broken. It will take them years to rebuild." Daniel nodded, the weight of their shared victory settling over him. "But the threat's not completely gone," he said. "There will always be those who resist change." Lyra turned to him, her eyes reflecting both determination and exhaustion. "Which is why we must ensure this peace is not just a temporary truce but a lasting alliance." He met her gaze, appreciating the strength in her words. "And we'll do it together," he said, "one step at a time." For a moment, they stood in silence, the bond between them a steady, comforting presence. Then, a voice called out from the camp, breaking the quiet. "Ambassador Rowe, Commander Lyra." A Sirac aide approached, bowing slightly. "The Council has requested your presence. They wish to formally acknowledge your success." Lyra inclined her head, her expression neutral. "We'll be there shortly." The aide nodded and retreated, leaving Daniel and Lyra alone once more. She sighed softly, her petals dimming as she allowed herself a rare moment of vulnerability. "This victory came at a cost," she said. "So many lives lost." Daniel reached out, his hand brushing against hers in a gesture of quiet support. "It wasn't for nothing," he said. "We've given both our people a chance for a better future." Lyra's fingers curled around his, her touch light but firm. "A future we must now build." They made their way back to the camp, where the atmosphere was a mix of relief and solemnity. The council, a group of Sirac leaders who had remained loyal to the cause, awaited them in the central tent. As Daniel and Lyra entered, the murmurs of the gathered leaders quieted, all eyes turning to them. One of the council members, an elder Serac with deep lines etched into his face, stepped forward. His petals glowed faintly as he spoke. Commander Lyra, Ambassador Rowe, your bravery and leadership have brought us to this moment. The rebels' defeat marks a turning point in our history. Another council member, a younger Serac with sharp features, nodded in agreement. Your bond has not only saved lives but shown us a new path forward. It is a symbol of unity. Daniel felt the weight of their words, understanding the significance of what they had achieved. Yet he couldn't shake the feeling that their work was far from over. He glanced at Lyra, who stood tall, her expression unreadable. "We are honored by your recognition," Lyra said, her voice calm and measured. "But the work of rebuilding begins now. The wounds of this conflict run deep, and it will take time to heal." The elder nodded solemnly. "You speak wisely, Commander. We will rely on your guidance as we move forward." After the formalities, Daniel and Lyra stepped outside, the weight of the council's expectations heavy on their shoulders. They walked in silence for a time, the cool evening air a welcome respite from the tense atmosphere of the camp. Eventually, they reached a quiet spot at the edge of the encampment, where the faint glow of the Serac sky cast a soft light over the landscape. Daniel leaned against a boulder, his arms crossed as he looked out over the plains. "Do you ever wonder," he said, his voice thoughtful, "if things could have been different? If we hadn't bonded that day?" Lyra stood beside him, her gaze distant. "I have considered it," she admitted, "but such thoughts are futile. What matters is the path we have chosen and the strength we find in it." Daniel nodded, her words resonating with him. "I guess you're right. No use dwelling on what could have been." He turned to her, his expression softening. "But for what it's worth, I'm glad we're in this together." Lyra's eyes met his, her petals glowing faintly. "As am I," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. In that quiet moment, the bond between them pulsed gently, a reminder of the connection they shared. Daniel reached out, his hand brushing against her arm, his touch lingering. Lyra didn't pull away. Instead, she stepped closer, her gaze steady. "Daniel," she said, her tone shifting to something softer, more personal, "I have learned much from you, about resilience, trust, and connection." He swallowed, his throat suddenly dry. "And I've learned from you, about strength and purpose, and what it means to truly rely on someone." They stood there, the distance between them closing as the bond deepened. Slowly, Daniel reached up, his hand gently cupping her cheek. Lyra's eyes fluttered closed for a moment, her petals glowing brighter in response to his touch. When she opened her eyes again, there was a warmth in them that he hadn't seen before. "We have faced many challenges together," she said softly. "And we will face many more." Daniel nodded, his thumb brushing lightly against her skin. "But we'll face them as a team." In the quiet stillness of the Serac night, their connection solidified, a shared understanding passing between them without the need for words. Whatever challenges lay ahead, they knew they could overcome them, together. The rebuilding began in earnest the following day. The aftermath of the conflict left both Serac and human forces stretched thin, but their combined efforts brought a sense of cautious optimism. Temporary shelters were erected around the ruins of the rebel stronghold, and joint teams worked tirelessly to restore basic infrastructure. For the first time in decades, Serac and human soldiers moved side by side, their former animosities slowly dissolving under the weight of shared purpose. Daniel stood near the edge of the camp, his sleeves rolled up as he helped unload crates of medical supplies from a transport vehicle. His muscles ached, but he found solace in the labor, the rhythm of work keeping his mind steady. He glanced over his shoulder to see Lyra speaking with a group of Serac engineers, her commanding presence as unwavering as ever. Even in the midst of chaos, she exuded calm and control. As if sensing his gaze, Lyra turned and made her way toward him. Her steps were purposeful, but the subtle glow of her petals hinted at something softer beneath her composed exterior. When she reached him, Daniel wiped his hands on a rag, offering her a tired smile. Taking a break from commanding the masses? He teased lightly. Lyra's lips curved into a faint smile. Even a commander must ensure her troops are properly supplied, she said, her tone playful yet measured. Daniel chuckled, leaning against the side of the transport. It's good to see everyone working together. Feels like we're finally moving forward. Lyra nodded, her gaze sweeping over the bustling camp. Progress is fragile, but it is progress nonetheless. We must nurture it carefully. Daniel watched her for a moment, appreciating the weight she carried. You've been holding us all together, he said. I don't think anyone else could have done it. Her expression softened, and she looked at him, the bond between them pulsing gently. I am not alone in this, she said. You have been my anchor, Daniel. Without you, I do not know if I could have borne this responsibility. The sincerity in her voice caught him off guard, and for a moment, the noise of the camp seemed to fade into the background. He reached out, his hand brushing lightly against her arm. We make a good team, he said softly. Lyra's petals glowed brighter at his touch, a silent acknowledgement of their connection. She stepped closer, her voice lowering. This bond we share, it has grown stronger than I ever anticipated. It is no longer just a symbol of unity for our people. It has become something deeply personal. Daniel felt his chest tighten, his own emotions mirroring hers. It's not just duty anymore, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. It's something more. Their eyes met, and for a moment, the world around them seemed to fade away. Slowly, Daniel reached up, his hand gently cupping her cheek. Lyra leaned into his touch, her eyes closing briefly as she allowed herself a rare moment of vulnerability. The sound of footsteps nearby pulled them back to reality, and they stepped apart as one of the human officers approached with a report. Daniel took it with a nod, his focus returning to the task at hand. The rest of the day passed in a blur of activity, with Daniel and Lyra working tirelessly to coordinate the rebuilding efforts. By nightfall, the camp had settled into a quiet hum, the soldiers and workers taking what rest they could. Daniel found himself back at the edge of the camp, sitting on a low crate and looking out at the distant horizon. The stars above were different from those of Earth, their unfamiliar constellations a reminder of just how far he was from home. Yet, despite the distance, he felt a strange sense of belonging here, among these people. The bond he shared with Lyra had become a cornerstone of that feeling, anchoring him in ways he hadn't expected. He heard soft footsteps behind him and turned to see Lyra approaching. She carried 2 steaming mugs, and as she reached him, she handed one over. Even commanders need a moment to breathe, she said, settling beside him. Daniel took the mug, the warmth seeping into his hands. Thanks, he said, taking a sip. The drink was rich and earthy, a Syrah blend he was starting to appreciate. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, the quiet night enveloping them. Finally, Lyra spoke, her voice thoughtful. Do you ever think about what comes next? Daniel glanced at her, his brow furrowing. What do you mean? For us, she said, her gaze steady. For our people. We have laid the foundation for peace, but the future remains uncertain. Daniel considered her words, then nodded slowly. I think about it all the time, he admitted. There's still a lot of work to do, and I know it won't be easy, but if we can get through everything we've faced so far, I believe we can handle whatever comes next. Lyra's expression softened, her petals glowing faintly. Your faith is a source of strength, she said. It gives me hope. Daniel reached out, his hand resting lightly on hers. We'll face it together, he said. Whatever the future holds. Lyra turned her hand, intertwining her fingers with his. Together, she agreed, her voice carrying a quiet resolve. They sat like that for a while longer, their hands joined, the bond between them a steady, comforting presence. The night stretched on, and as they looked out over the camp, they felt the weight of their shared journey and the promise of the path ahead. For the first time in what felt like forever, Daniel allowed himself to simply be in the moment. The challenges ahead would come soon enough, but for now, he was content to sit beside Lyra, their connection unbreakable and their future unwritten. The weeks following the battle passed in a blur of activity and quiet reflection. The combined forces of Serac and human allies worked tirelessly to establish stability in the region. With the immediate threat of the rebels diminished, the focus shifted to rebuilding not only the physical infrastructure but also the fragile trust between their peoples. Daniel and Lyra became central figures in this effort. Their bond, once an unintended consequence of cultural misunderstanding, had grown into a powerful symbol of unity. Together, they held countless meetings, mediated disputes, and planned for the future. Yet, even amid the flurry of responsibilities, they found moments to nurture their personal connection. One such moment came on a quiet evening. The camp was still, most of the soldiers and workers having retired for the night. Daniel sat by the central fire pit, the flames casting flickering shadows across his face. He was lost in thought when Lyra approached, her footsteps light but deliberate. "May I join you?" she asked softly. Daniel looked up and smiled. "Always." She settled beside him, her presence bringing a warmth that rivaled the fire. For a while, they simply sat in silence, the crackling flames filling the void between words. Then, Lyra spoke, her voice thoughtful. "The Council has proposed formalizing the alliance," she said. "A new treaty that would bind our peoples beyond this conflict." Daniel nodded. "It's the right move," he said. "We need something solid to build on." Lyra hesitated, her gaze fixed on the fire. "They wish for us to lead the effort," she said quietly. "To be the faces of this new chapter." Daniel exhaled, the weight of her words settling over him. "That's a big responsibility," he said. "But I can't think of anyone better for the job." Lyra turned to him, her eyes searching his. "It will not be easy," she said. "There will be resistance, even from those who claim to support peace." He reached out, his hand covering hers. "We've faced worse," he said. "And we'll face this too." Together, the bond between them pulsed gently, a quiet reassurance that neither of them was alone. Lyra's petals glowed softly in response, their light reflecting the steady rhythm of their connection. "I do not fear the challenge," she said, her voice firm, "as long as you are by my side." Daniel smiled, a warmth spreading through his chest. "Always," he said, echoing her earlier words. The next morning, they stood together before the gathered forces of both Serac and human contingents. The announcement of the proposed treaty was met with a mix of cautious optimism and quiet murmurs. Yet, as Daniel and Lyra spoke, their words carried a conviction that slowly began to resonate with the crowd. "Our bond is a testament to what we can achieve when we choose to see beyond our differences," Lyra said, her voice clear and strong. "It is not a weakness, but a strength." Daniel stepped forward, his gaze sweeping over the assembly. "We've seen what happens when fear and mistrust take root," he said. "But we've also seen the power of unity. Together, we can build a future that honors both our peoples." The crowd erupted into applause, a wave of support that bolstered their resolve. The first steps toward lasting peace had been taken, and while the road ahead would be long, it was a path they were ready to walk. In the days that followed, the camp became a hub of diplomatic activity. Delegates from both sides arrived to begin drafting the treaty, their discussions often stretching late into the night. Daniel and Lyra were at the center of it all, their bond providing a steady foundation for the delicate negotiations. Despite the grueling schedule, they made time for each other, retreating to their shared tent in the quiet hours of the night. It was during one of these moments, as they lay side by side beneath the canvas roof, that Lyra spoke of her hopes for the future. "Our peoples have endured so much," she said, her voice a soft murmur in the darkness. "But I believe we can create something enduring." Sci-Fi HFY. Daniel reached for her hand, their fingers intertwining. "We will," he said, his voice filled with quiet determination. "And it'll start with us." Their connection deepened in those quiet moments, their bond becoming an unshakable pillar of trust and affection. They found solace in each other, their shared experiences forging a partnership that transcended cultural boundaries. As the treaty neared completion, The camp prepared for a grand ceremony to mark the occasion. The atmosphere was charged with anticipation, the soldiers and workers taking pride in their collective achievement. On the morning of the ceremony, Daniel and Lyra stood together before a large gathering of Serac and human delegates. The elder council member, who had been a staunch supporter of their efforts, stepped forward to address the crowd. "Today, we bear witness to the dawn of a new era," he said, his voice resonant. "An era of cooperation, trust, and unity. Let this treaty serve as a beacon for generations to come." As the treaty was signed, the crowd erupted into applause, the sound echoing across the plains. Daniel and Lyra exchanged a glance, a shared understanding passing between them. Their journey had been fraught with challenges, but they had emerged stronger for it. That evening, under the light of the Serac moons, they stood together on a hill overlooking the camp. The stars above seemed to shine brighter, a reflection of the hope that now filled the air. Lyra turned to Daniel, her petals glowing softly. "We have come far," she said, her voice filled with quiet pride. Daniel smiled, his hand resting on her arm. "And we're just getting started." They stood in comfortable silence, the weight of their shared journey settling over them. The future was uncertain, but they knew they would face it together, their bond unbreakable. In that moment, beneath the vast expanse of stars, they found peace, not just for their peoples, but for themselves. And as they looked out over the camp, they knew their legacy would endure, a testament to the power of unity and the strength of their connection.